Thank you. So it's a big subject to cover in 10 minutes, so I'll be missing a few pieces, I think. But yeah, as Sean said, I'm a game critic, and I often write about race and representation in games. So I'm just going to use the next 10 minutes to talk about a couple of ways that specifically black representation in games is affected by how we've been depicted throughout history. Maybe that's not going to work. I'll just do this. So I'll begin with Cuphead, actually. And so Cuphead's an example of how a game where historic representations of black people in animation will affect the art that we see today. And Cuphead's images and aesthetic are an homage to 1920s Fleischer and Disney cartoons. And that makes it look really unique in comparison to a lot of other run-and-gun 2D platformers. But the game doesn't include people of color, and that's likely because any representation of them that was true to form would have been considered racist. And that's an inherent problem with paying homage to an aesthetic that's steeped in racism. The imagery and general aesthetic of your game is going to say something, even if you don't intend it to. So I'd argue that the main character of the game, or the characters of the game, Cuphead and Mugman, they have roots in minstrel archetypes. The character on the left of the slide is called Bosco the Talking Kid, who was one of the first animated characters ever created and was inspired by minstrel characters. And his lineage includes Mickey Mouse and leads all the way up to Cuphead. And to define a minstrel has feral cleverness, agility, musicality, and resistance to oppression. And the minstrel signifies the rebellious commodity, the slave who won't do his work, or the cups who won't pay their gambling debt, in the case of Cuphead. So a lot of early cartoons were designed with these archetypes in mind, and archetypes which were then inherited by later cartoons. And Studio MDHR, the developers of the game, may not have been living in the same time period that gave birth to these harmful stereotypes. But in paying homage, they're dipping into the exact same inkwell, so to speak. Now, Cuphead is also inspired by images of gambling, heaven, and hell. The game's main characters, as I mentioned, owe the devil their souls from a gambling debt. And it's a bit weird that casinos and gambling are even present in a game that's mainly about exploring a colorful fantasy world full of old-fashioned cartoon tropes. But the prevalence of gambling is telling of the nature of their source material, because gambling and religious morality themes were often present in cartoons at the time, which denigrated black culture. One example, a prominent example of this, is Clean Pastures by Merry Melodies. And this was a cartoon where Harlem was depicted as this hotbed of sin and gambling. Black angels from a minstrel heaven have to use jazz to lure Harlem's residents away from their sinful lives of listening to other jazz. So jazz music is presented as both enjoyable but inherently sinful, which reflected white America's relationship with it. There's a love of jazz combined with a prejudice against the black people who produce it. So that's where a lot of the connection between blackness, gambling, and sinfulness lies. And that's a relationship which Cuphead inadvertently treads in despite trying to appear devoid of prejudice. A further example of this is Cab Calloway, who was a prolific and talented big band performer in the 20s, and he showed up in a lot of 20s cartoons. And his homage, or his image, shows up in Cuphead as King Dice, who's the devil's main henchman in the game. And it's the closest Cuphead kind of comes to depicting a black person, but it falls short in the same way its cartoon inspirations do. Cab Calloway in cartoons of the time is presented sometimes as a caricature, sometimes as a whitewashed figure, but never as himself. Black culture and jazz is used through his music and his voice, but true black representation is missing. It's a sanitized and stripped down version of the original performer, and Cuphead is guilty of doing the same thing. Now, there's a responsibility when you make a game as popular and far-reaching as Cuphead. Every week we see a new example of Cuphead fan art. There is a lot of it. And these replicate the aesthetics that Cuphead reinforced in its homage, but they're just as ignorant of the history. That means not only new art, but old cartoons are spread out into the timeline, and they have an effect on gamers of color. So all this is worth weighing against the need to employ a particular aesthetic. Now, should you still want to engage with an aesthetic, my advice would be to not flatten or purify the past, but to face it head on. Two examples are The Story of OJ by Jay-Z and Mark Romanek, which was a music video that used famous minstrel caricatures from old cartoons in a music video in order to make a point that you can't really escape the past or how black people are seen and how we kind of depict and see ourselves. And there's Kara Walker, who's an artist who uses a historic paper cutout style to depict mammies and sambos from the plantation era to dredge up issues of identity, history, femininity, and race. So these are cases where the artists have decided to engage directly with caricature and stereotype to make a statement on racism in America, to not let us forget the history behind images. Now, even when it comes to literally depicting black people, visual media still has quite a few shortcomings. And games are inspired, of course, by film aesthetics, and film history has a major bias toward lighter skin. So this is an old photo of my family, of my grandmother and my uncles. And anyone who has dark-skinned relatives in their family who has pictures of them from before the 80s or 90s probably has a picture like this one, where some of your relatives just get lost in the darkness. Some family members were just cursed to never show up on film. And that's because of Shirley cards. So these are images that were used to calibrate film stock, and they almost always used white women as the subject. In the 80s, Kodak introduced film that could capture darker skin tones, but this was an unintended consequence. They were actually rolling out a line of film designed to better capture wood grain in furniture catalogs. Black people were an afterthought. Darker skin was an afterthought in this case. Now, games, unfortunately, also have a long bias with lighter skin tone, or for lighter skin tone. Punch-Out, which is a game with an extremely limited color palette because it was made for the NES, still manages to have multiple shades available for its lighter characters, and exactly one shade for all of its boxes of color. Now, technology has improved and become a lot more photoreal, but it still suffers from similar biases. This is an image called Lee Perry Smith, colloquially. It's game's version of the Shirley card, essentially. It's a sample model that's used by students learning how to light and texture skin. Of course, it begs the question, where is the black Lee Perry Smith? Their absence implies people in games are learning how to make white people first and everyone else second. And this leads to problems like games like Skyrim. Old game, but still relevant, where lighter skinned characters can look well balanced in spite of the dimness of their surroundings, while darker skinned characters wind up looking flat and uninteresting. And this is what happens when lighter skin is the baseline, the status quo. You build the world to work perfectly for that and sort of okay for everyone else. And thanks to Tanya DePass for the screenshot, which shows up in the article we wrote for Waypoint about the subject, if you want to read more about it. So Kerry James Marshall is another artist, and he works in black portraiture, experiments with exploring blackness via painting and identity. And he wrote that the way I see it is if you're going to deal with black representation, you have to show that you can do two things at once. You can be completely invested in the image and also the idea of the aesthetic experience of the object. Now what this means is kind of exemplified by, I think, easily by Moonlight and Insecure, which is a movie and a TV show, respectively. And seeing them was really shocking to me because seeing black skin lit so well and so purposefully was kind of a revelation. We have the image, but we also have the aesthetic. It's not just lighting, it's evoking atmosphere and character through the lighting. And that's going against the historic tendency to overlight darker skin tones, which would wind up desaturating it often. In Moonlight, the intent is to evoke a beautiful nightmare of Miami, according to the co-writer Terrell McCraney. And Insecure uses lighting to evoke black beauty, youth, and playfulness. And we're seeing that happen in games, for sure. We have creators of all races taking the time and consideration to create interesting, well-designed, realistic characters who aren't background, afterthoughts, but the leads and the heroes. And there are examples of artists trying to push representation forward and to be aware of history and problems with representation, and their characters reflect that. So Ronald Wimberly wrote a comic for the Nib about skin color called Lighten Up, and he's a comic artist. And he was asked in a comic about Wolverine to lighten a character of color's skin tone by his editor, who's white. And it made him think about the difference a few degrees of skin tone can make, about how race is both a made-up social signifier, but also something more set in stone as a result of art. And he wrote that art is where associations are made. Art is where we form the narratives of our identity. And that's why this stuff is so deeply important. Thank you.